All right, so when you think Coast Guard, what pops into your head? Probably rescue swimmers jumping into stormy seas, right? Or maybe cutters patrolling a big city harbor. But what if I told you their coast stretches thousands of miles inland and, get this, all the way across the entire globe? It's pretty wild. So let's find out just how far their mission really goes.
So that brings us to the big question, right? Where does the coast and Coast Guard actually end? I mean, is it just the beach, a few miles offshore? Well, the answer is going to blow your mind. It's not just some line on the sand. It stretches all the way from the American heartland to the farthest corners of the planet.
Okay, so first stop on this journey is probably the last place you'd ever expect, the American heartland. Yeah, I'm talking hundreds and hundreds of miles away from any ocean. Because out here, the Coast Guard runs what you can only describe as America's inland navy.
And the scale of this is just wow. We're talking about the Coast Guard's Heartland District, which covers 26 states. Let that sink in. 26. That's more than half the country, all being watched over by the same folks we usually picture out on the salty ocean. And listen, we're not talking about some small creeks or little ponds here. These are the absolute lifelines of American commerce. We're talking about the Coast Guard patrolling the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Missouri, basically all the major river systems. They're out there making sure navigation is safe and keeping these incredibly vital waterways secure.
All right, so from the rivers, let's head north. We're going to another huge, non-ocean territory, the freshwater frontier. Yep, we're talking about the Great Lakes.
Now you have to understand, these aren't just places you go for a weekend of boating. No way. The Coast Guard sees the Great Lakes as a full-on strategic maritime frontier. They're managing a massive amount of commercial shipping, and this is a big one, they're guarding a huge international border.
And when I say huge, I mean it. The Coast Guard is responsible for 1,500 miles of the U.S.-Canada border, just on the Great Lakes. That's a massive law enforcement and national security job, and it's all happening in fresh water. Okay, so let's finally head out to the open ocean, right? Their home turf. But even here, in what we think of as their most familiar environment, the Coast Guard's authority goes way, way beyond what you can see from the shore. They're literally policing the deep blue. So the first layer of their power out there is something called the contiguous zone. This goes out 24 nautical miles from the coast. And inside this zone, they have the power to enforce U.S. laws on things like customs, taxes, immigration, you name it. It's kind of like a legal front porch for the entire country. But wait, it gets so much bigger. Beyond that 24-mile line, you hit the exclusive economic zone, or the EEZ for short. This is a gigantic area stretching 200 nautical miles from shore. And in that zone, the U.S. basically has the rights to all the natural resources, the fish, the oil, you name it. And just look at the difference in scale here. We're not talking about a small jump. That 200 nautical mile zone gives the Coast Guard a ridiculously huge area of responsibility. We're talking about a chunk of ocean territory that's actually bigger than the entire U.S. landmass. And that is all their beat.
So what in the world are they doing that far from land? Well, they're protecting our economy and our planet. They're out there enforcing complicated fishing laws to stop illegal operations. They're making sure our waters aren't polluted, and they're the ones who make sure international treaties are actually being followed out in the high seas. But believe it or not, even 200 miles out isn't the end of the story. The Coast Guard's reach goes even further, to the most remote corners of the globe, and, fascinatingly, into domains that aren't even physical. I mean, you've got Coast Guard cutters and planes deploying all over the world. They're doing patrols in the freezing Arctic, they're running operations in the remote South Pacific, they're even conducting anti-piracy missions on the high seas, often working right alongside the U.S. Navy. At this point, their coast is, well, it's the entire planet. And this right here, this quote, is really the key to understanding it all. They're a federal agency with the authority to enforce U.S. law anywhere a nexus to maritime commerce exists. What does that mean? It means their jurisdiction isn't about a place on a map. It's about a purpose. If a crime, any crime, has a connection to shipping or trade that happens on the water, they can get involved. Doesn't matter where in the world it is. And that brings us to their newest and maybe most important frontier, the non-physical coast. Think about it. In today's world, protecting maritime commerce isn't just about ships. It's about protecting our ports from cyber attacks. It's about regulating incredibly complex shipping rules. And it's about securing the digital infrastructure that the entire global trade system runs. So after seeing all this, it's pretty clear, right? The coast is so much more than just a line on a map.
For the U.S. Coast Guard, it's a mission that's always expanding, with a horizon that just keeps moving further and further out. Just think about the journey we took. We started on America's inland rivers, then we went to the Great Lakes, we pushed out into the deep oceans, then all the way across the global high seas, and we finally ended up in the digital world. That is the true scope of the U.S. Coast Guard today.
And as the Arctic ice melts and opens up brand new sea lanes, and as cyber threats to global trade get more and more sophisticated, the Coast Guard's mission is just going to keep growing. So really the question isn't where their coast ends today. The real question is, what new, totally unforeseen coasts will they be called on to guard tomorrow?